Dr. Thomas Tiedt.
I apologize for having such a difficult name. You did pronounce it correctly.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to address the committee. A neuroscientist for 22 years, I'm observing many statements being made in contradiction to extensive scientific and clinical evidence. I urge looking at Gulf War syndrome from two directions. First, list the pathophysiologies that could cause each symptom. I believe you will find cholinergic syndrome a common thread. Second, compare the list of symptoms with a list of side effects from any cholinesterase inhibitor. I believe you will find a match. All acetylcholinesterase inhibitors cause stunning nerve and muscle degeneration within 30 minutes of just a single dose. Much is known about this toxicity, including the subcellular mechanisms. Analogous to the term autoimmune, I use the term autopathology to describe the harmful consequences of too much neurotransmitter. One look at the electron micrographs will shock anyone. That not all the damage could be reversible is obvious. My team's research back in the 70s appears to have inspired my university colleagues and the Pentagon laboratories to explore PB, in particular, pyridostigmine, in depth. These laboratories published many detailed and highly relevant studies prior to the Gulf War. By 1984, the Pentagon knew PB was not a protectant against sarin, eliminating any validity for its uncontrolled and unmonitored use on 500,000 soldiers, representing the world's largest clinical trial. There was no possible benefit to balance the certain and substantial risk. Seemingly contradictory, various epidemiological studies have failed to reveal the existence of Gulf War syndrome. However, entry criteria and causal assumptions are key to the results, and apparent lack of epidemiological support does not rule out an actual event. Many vets were excluded from these studies. The controls were not evaluated for cholinergic drugs. The quality of data, I'm sure we all know by now about the Gulf War vets, is poor at best. Also, it is incomplete to compare a group of the healthiest and most resilient to the general population or to an elderly population. Nevertheless, one series of epidemiological studies called CCEP shows a higher incidence of several disorders of Gulf War vets. Presumably, these results are the reason the Pentagon abandoned its 5-year denial of Gulf War syndrome last April. Now the Pentagon says only 20% of the cases are psychological. The CDC has reported a higher incidence of 13 chronic symptoms among Gulf War vets. The Institute of Medicine concluded at least a few CCEP patients have developed illnesses that are directly related to their Persian Gulf service. The following research findings must be considered, almost all of which was missed even in last month's release of what looks to be a very exhaustive review of Gulf War syndrome from the IOM. The collective message of hundreds of relevant and unrefuted studies about nerve and muscle toxicity. 2, weeks after cessation of 1 week of low-dose PB treatment, behavioral changes not apparent during treatment were revealed. This study will be reported in just a few days here in Washington, D.C. at the annual Society for Neuroscience meetings. A 1996 report showed that Gulf War veterans displayed various objective signs of neurotoxicity several years after the Gulf War. The authors postulated a role for the well-known PB toxicity on nerves and muscles. Half of the 500,000 soldiers taking PB reported acute toxicity, that is, cholinergic crisis. In view of the high dose and frequency of use, surely even more soldiers actually experience cholinergic side effects. Just a 5% incidence of chronic effect would explain thousands of cases of Gulf War syndrome. Acetylcholinesterase inhibition and the neurotoxicity induced by PB, sarin, and DEET are synergistic. This synergism can unmask unobservable effects of these agents given alone. PB does not protect against nerve gas. In fact, PB pre-treatment worsens nerve gas toxicity. Administering PB after nerve gas exposure is uniformly contraindicated. At sublethal dosage, PB is more toxic than sarin, shown by the Pentagon research during the 80s. A 1993 clinical report using electromyography concluded PB toxicity was typical of acetylcholinesterase inhibitor toxicity. PB also induces growth and hormone release, cardiomyopathy, mitochondrial damage, developmental toxicity, decreased ability to work in the heat, increased plasma CPK, Parkinsonism, and permanent effects on sexual differentiation and brain norepinephrine levels. Increased acetylcholine levels in the brain has a role in schizophrenia and psychosis. Furthermore, schizophrenics are more sensitive to PB's effects to increase growth hormone release. Cases of congenital myasthenia have been associated with acetylcholinesterase deficiency, placental transfer of PB, and lengthening of acetylcholine receptor ion channel open time. Concluded in many studies is that acetylcholinesterase inhibitor therapy has counterproductive consequences in myasthenia gravis. The difference in susceptibility to acetylcholinesterase inhibitors between normal individuals and myasthenia gravis patients should not be overlooked. What is relatively acceptable in myasthenia patients is very different from what anyone would anticipate in healthy individuals, especially when they are under stress, an added risk factor for cholinergic syndrome. The large body of evidence documenting short and long-term effects of cholinergic crisis forms part of a larger research field called excitotoxicity. Many and diverse studies implicate excitotoxins in neurodegenerative diseases. Recent reports show that excitotoxicity causes DNA damage. Incidentally, enough excitotoxic destruction of central cholinergic synapses would lead to Alzheimer or ALS-type symptoms, memory loss, and confusion. Enough chronic cell damage might predispose to autoimmune problems. We need to be careful about tinkering with neurotransmitters. Deletions of mitochondrial DNA are associated with myopathy. Organophosphates are well known for producing nerve degeneration. This effect does not involve acetylcholinesterase inhibitor toxicity, has a delayed onset following a single exposure, and has been responsible for devastating epidemics of neurotoxic injury. A 1993 report showed extensive nerve and muscle toxicity without symptoms of acute toxicity from an organophosphate. These clinical findings were attributed to the well-known toxic effects of acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. In summary, it appears compelling that there is a strong correlation of Gulf War syndrome with cholinergic syndrome or cholinergic crisis and organophosphate-induced toxicity. There can be no doubt that acetylcholinesterase inhibitors played at least some role and caused at least some toxicity to our troops. Unfortunately, Gulf War syndrome is not an easy disease. It's probably a multifaceted disease with multiple causes. But other diseases do not get so mistreated for not having a single cause. Other causal factors should be evaluated, although I know of no other explanation with as much relevant and mainstream data or that can explain as many cases. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there questions for Dr. Tiedt from the committee? I would like to request you state in your testimony, refer to a number of studies and give the date of the study. Could you please supply the committee with the references to where those studies are
Sure.
published?
On a number of occasions, I have supplied to the committee a bibliography of these studies, particularly January 17th in response to a White House call to my home. Added studies have occurred since that time, and I'll be very glad to do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Doctor, can you explain a little bit about your background and why you have an interest in this?
I have an interest because I published what unfortunately might be the most definitive study on acetylcholinesterase inhibitor toxicity back in the 70s. Frankly, I was watching television in May of 1994, and I was shocked off my couch. And when I watched, almost analogous to the cigarette CEOs, when the Pentagon, FDA, and NIH stood up and raised their right hand and actually said to the public and to Senator Rockefeller's committee that PB has no known toxicity. Well, hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on that. And for government officials to get up and say it doesn't exist and just take that magic slate that kids use, I think is very, very improper. And so I've been really involved ever since. Someone has to speak out about the science. It is improper that, that the American public has spent about $1 billion of relevant research. And even the Institute of Medicine's report last month, which is, I think, a very exhaustive document, it doesn't even scratch the surface. None of the studies I outlined for you today, which represent hundreds of studies, were in that report, in the bibliography. If we don't use the research that we do, why do we do it? Eventually the public is going to stop funding this gravy train for scientists. We must stop that.
Where are you based now? What is your research activity at this time?
I'm not involved directly in research. I left academic research in 1978. I then went to the pharmaceutical industry, which gives me some insight to the records that probably exist about all these chemicals in the actual drug companies. And these days I'm working on writing a book about things like this, actually about a larger subject called white-collar crime.
I see. Okay. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.